Our lives today are enhanced by technology, but the foundations for our extraordinary high-tech world don't just come from the West. A huge role was also played by Muslim scientists and thinkers in the Middle Ages. Dr. Hayat Sindi is a medical scientist from Saudi Arabia. She's taking a road trip from San Francisco down through California and onto Los Angeles. She wants to find out how our modern world has been influenced by Islamic innovations, science, and technology. From the way we use computers to the way we make maps. From food and farming to the ability to fly. And from the study of sight and delight to the science of stars and solar systems. This is the story of how Muslim science helped to invent the world we live in today. Islam's golden age is said to have started during the rule of the Abbasid dynasty in the middle of the 8th century. In 762, they began construction of a huge new city known as the City of Peace, or Baghdad.
I think we can define the beginning of the golden age as having started in Baghdad, which was the capital of the Abbasid Empire. The Islamic Empire at that period was growing very rapidly, and I mean, it expanded to be huge, running from Andalusia, from Spain in the west, to India in the east.
The city turned into the center of the Muslim world and the nexus for scientific discovery and innovation.
There was a real culture of investigation and inquiry sponsored by members of the elite who were very keen to learn everything they could about the knowledge of the time.
This is a period of heightened intellectual activity where Muslims absorb, naturalize, transform, and contribute to various forms of knowledge in philosophy, in astronomy, in mathematics, medicine, legal theory, and so on and so forth.
The intellectual heart of Baghdad was the House of Wisdom. The House of Wisdom filled up with translations of great works from ancient Greece. But Muslim scientists would then take this old knowledge and come up with new ideas and theories that would transform their world. But how has Muslim science and learning from the Middle Ages impacted on our world today? Dr. Hayat Sindi wants to find out. She's about to take a trip through America's Golden State, California. This is where scientists and engineers developed many of the devices and inventions integral to our lives today. First, Dr. Hayat is visiting one of the state's famous universities, which produced many of these brilliant brains. Just like the University of Al-Qarawiyyin in Fez, the oldest educational institution in the world, in the first place to ever award a degree, established by a Muslim woman in Morocco in the year 859.
Fatima al-Fihriya was the daughter of a very rich merchant from Kairouan, Tunisia. And she decided to create a large mosque. This mosque would become a very important educational center. Its teaching started as mainly religious and legal studies, and it was also a place of political discussion, and slowly more and more topics were added, such as poetry, grammar, medicine, astronomy, mathematics. Fatima al-Fihriya played a very significant role. She actually created a center of knowledge that lasted centuries and impacted not only the Muslim world, but beyond.
Institutions, universities, learning centers are the critical pillars to any economic stability and prosperity.
Stanford, in the time it was founded, California would have been a kind of frontier, at least in terms of higher education. And I think part of what the Stanfords recognized was that if California was to blossom, was to become something more than just a frontier outpost, that it needed universities, that universities provide not only a cohort of educated young people, but also culture, learning, and a kind of center of gravity for the building of a modern economy and a modern society.
In the second half of the 20th century, Stanford played a key role in California's boom in computing and electronics. Famous tech companies like Google, Hewlett-Packard, Instagram, and Netflix were all founded by graduates of the university.
One of the fundamental beliefs of Stanford is that a computer scientist or an engineer who has also studied history and literature, engaged with ethical and philosophical questions, will not only be a better person and citizen, will also be a better engineer or computer scientist.
We need to really encourage the culture of education, the culture of innovation, the culture of practicality, the culture of how we link that to the humanity, how we feel our challenges, and try to channel that from the start to have that impact in our communities.
The desire to learn is just as important as it was 1,000 years ago. But today, it's not just us who are learning. We're now surrounded by technology that thinks for itself. Whether it's computers or sat-navs, smartphones or smart speakers, devices we use at home, work, or just out and about. But how do they think? What makes them smart? It all comes down to mathematics. And it all started in Baghdad. Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi came from the fabled city of Khiva, which is today in Uzbekistan. He moved to Baghdad to become one of the leading scholars at the House of Wisdom. Al-Khwarizmi invented rules for mathematical formulas and detailed the steps to solve equations. And it was the Latin version of his name, algorithmus, that gave us the word for these logical steps, or algorithms.
He was a mathematician. He was following in the footsteps of earlier Muslim mathematicians. He's particularly associated with the development of algebra.
He is essentially the father of algebra. He wrote a textbook in the early 9th century in Baghdad. In that book, he describes how to solve equations, the stuff that we learn at school, x plus y. Now, before Al-Khwarizmi, people knew about solving quadratic equations. The ancient Greeks, even the ancient Babylonians knew about it. But they were solving them for specific examples. For Al-Khwarizmi, he said, no, I want to give you a general set of rules as to how you solve any quadratic equation. That set of rules became known as the algorithm.
So just how important are these mathematical sets of rules in our lives today? To find out, Dr. Hayat is meeting a software engineer who spent years working on algorithms for Google.
What is an algorithm?
It's basically a way to go from a question to an answer, if you will. It's about transforming an input into an output. And it goes through functions and it goes through computations. And eventually it says, here's what we think is a great answer. Honestly, I don't know how I would live my life in a world where we didn't have algorithms to help me find the things that I need.
So what is the future for an algorithm, and how we can use an algorithm to enhance the life or the environment situation in a developing world?
I mean, it's a really good question. And so one example from my Google days was that when you live in a fairly poor community, you may not have access to information in the same way that you have in a more developed country. And now say that you're a farmer, wouldn't it be very helpful if you could know what the weather forecast was? If you could go online and do some research about, hey, it's going to be an unusually cold summer, what should I do to protect my crops and actually have a good yield? And just the fact that you can now go to a search engine and get that answer, and a pretty good answer, in a matter of seconds, that's amazing.
It is amazing to know from somebody like Frederick, how can we use data to help our mothers and fathers and even our children to live a quality life.
The power of the algorithm has brought about a data revolution. But during the golden age of Islam, Muslim scientists also used data to help make sense of the world around them. One of the most influential geographers of the Muslim world was Muhammad al-Idrisi. He was born in North Africa in 1100 and spent his early life traveling around Europe and Muslim Spain.
Muhammad al-Idrisi was one in a long line of Muslim geographers who wrote descriptions of the world. These are sometimes described as road books or manuals for travel.
In 1138, al-Idrisi was asked by Roger, the northern king of Sicily, to create a collection of maps using knowledge that had been gathered by merchants and explorers.
It was based on descriptions from people who'd clearly traveled to places, not necessarily al-Idrisi himself, although he was probably fairly well traveled. One thing it's important to remember, of course, is that Muslims knew very well the world was round all the way through this period. So when they're doing maps, they are also aware of the world as a globe.
Al-Idrisi spent nearly 18 years at Roger's court compiling all the information. This was all turned into the Book of Roger, a collection of 70 maps combined with detailed notes and descriptions. When put together, the maps became a plan of the world, stretching from Spain in the west to China in the east, from Britain in the north to Africa and the Middle East in the south. The Book of Roger gave more information about people and places than any other medieval map. And this remained so for the next 3 centuries. Nearly 1,000 years later, maps are still just as important. But they're being collated and delivered in a very different way. Dr. Hayat has come to the center of San Francisco to a company at the cutting edge of mapping today. Mapbox is a tech company who make custom online maps for platforms and websites like Facebook, Lonely Planet, and Snapchat.
The amazing thing about El-Idrisi was he took a systematic approach to compiling various sorts of information and putting them into a map. And that map was used, actually unedited, for hundreds of years afterwards. He collected information. It wasn't just geographic information about what the landmass was, but it was information about the people who lived there and the climate and the practices. He was in Sicily and people were traveling back and forth, and so he'd interview them and say, what's going on there, what's happening, what's it like? And that would be equivalent to what we call crowdsourcing. And they were able to tie all those things into location, which is a very powerful concept that we see today.
Modern cartography is very dependent on how we amass huge arrays of facts and information.
The big change since in the last 1,000 years has been in the ability to collect data very, very quickly. Now we all carry around in our pocket the possibility of mapping. We all carry phones which know where we are and can send that, can trace that and send it back. For the developing world, that gives you the ability to really start to understand, diagnose, and act on a lot of the development issues.
It's very crucial to know because there is no limits, which is amazing. You make me fall in love with this type of technology. Data is powerful, information is powerful, and we can build in that to enhance and to refine how we be connected for the rest of the world and how we can have some aid and some help and support. It's all about how to live safely and in a secure way.
Muslim scientists didn't just develop our understanding of the Earth, they wanted to look further. Since the dawn of time, people have wanted to understand our universe. Astronomy was always of particular importance in Islam. Before clocks and compasses, Muslim scientists worked out the time of the 5 daily prayers using the sun's position in the sky. They also determined the direction of Mecca from any location by examining the position of the sun and the moon. But astronomy also sought to answer a number of other big questions about the cosmos.
Astronomy was one of the most important areas of science at that time, but of course, the scholars of the Islamic world didn't have telescopes. That didn't happen until the beginning of the 17th century. What they did, however, was a continuation of the work of the ancient Greeks.
Before the golden age of Islam, the most important astronomical work had been carried out by Greek scientists, like Aristotle and Ptolemy. Ptolemy's astronomy had improved on Aristotle's work, but there was still great tension between these two scientists and their models of the universe, both of which still had the Earth at its center.
What Muslims did is that they tried to resolve this tension. There were certain elements within the astronomy of Ptolemy that were problematic. So Muslims were basically modifying these astronomical models to give better predictive capacity while resolving the problems that were introduced by Ptolemy.
And so Muslim astronomers created their own new models of the universe, which would lead to the way we understand it today, with the sun, not the Earth, at its center. Scientists like El-Sufi looked further at the stars and produced the beautiful drawings of the constellations and galaxies. El-Sufi conceived new explanations for the movements of heavenly bodies. And Al-Bayruni and Al-Battani produced great astronomical tables, which will be quoted 500 years later in the work of Western astronomers like Copernicus during the European Renaissance.
So if you look at Copernicus's great text, De Revolutionibus, there are tables of star charts written in Arabic because Copernicus had access to Arabic writing, Arabic text on astronomy. And then they were later used by many explorers. People like Marco Polo and Columbus were using star charts developed by astronomers in the Islamic world.
Dr. Hayat is meeting Professor of Astronomy Alex Filipenko at the historic Lick Observatory up in the San Jose Mountains south of San Francisco.
When I was a child, I used to wear a cardboard on top of my head. I was imagining I was walking on the moon.
Yes.
So why is that most children are fascinated by astronomy?
Well, astronomy is amazingly appealing to children and the youth because everyone has looked up at the stars and marveled at their beauty and wondered what relation they have to us.
Tell us a little bit more about the Islamic civilization during the Golden Age, especially in astronomers like Al-Battani.
They made measurements of the positions of stars and they tracked the motion of the sun and the moon. And this all became the basis of what we call modern astronomy. It influenced people like Copernicus, who then influenced Kepler and Newton. And here we are with Newtonian physics that goes, in a sense, all the way back to those ancient studies. And the contributions of those astronomers are commemorated in a number of ways. Many of the brightest stars in the sky have names that bear an Arabic origin. And the 24 craters on the moon are named after Islamic scholars.
Today, astronomy is being used not only to understand our universe, it's also giving rise to interplanetary exploration and space technology. But this spectacular science would never have scaled such heights without the astonishing work of Muslim astronomers.
We need to be inspired, and astronomy breeds so many amazing scientists. When I was a child, I was inspired to become a scientist because I had this big passion toward astronomy. And I think any amazing things in life start always with inspiration.
The golden age of Islam saw the Muslim world stretch across many miles from Arabia. And 20 years after Baghdad was first built, another impressive metropolis arose in Al-Andalus, the Arabic name for Muslim Spain. Cordoba would become the largest and probably the most cultured city in Europe. At its center stood the Great Mosque, an architectural masterpiece built from granite, marble, onyx, and jasper. Al-Andalus was also known for the great strides made by scholars in the science of agriculture. There was already a good understanding of soil crops and botany, and the use of plants and herbs for food and in medicine. But scientists also worked out how to bring new plants into Muslim Spain and maximize their production. Many crops were introduced to the province, such as rice, sugarcane, almonds, and oranges. All of these crops needed sun, soil, and plenty of irrigation. So, Muslim scientists improved on the Roman methods of getting water from the rivers.
They very much built up the irrigation infrastructure in the parts of the Islamic world that they controlled, with a number of different techniques, including underwater channels of various different kinds. They were also very skilled in developing water wheel technology to raise water from rivers up to fields and from one terrace to another.
The Noria was a wheel fitted with buckets that picked up water and sent it to gardens and cultivated land. It was the Muslim world where water wheels were first used on a large scale for both irrigation and urban use. The idea of using technology to grow crops on an industrial scale has inspired the way they do farming today in California. Here at Wolf Farms, they are using a cutting-edge irrigation system, sending water through pipes buried below the surface, known as drip.
Before drip was brought to California, it was flood irrigated. And so now with drip, we're not only using less water, but we're producing more.
Amazing.
So I'll give you a couple of examples. Processing tomatoes. Before drip, we were using probably 42 inches of water per acre. Today with buried drip, we're putting on about 28 to 32 inches of water per acre. And our yields have doubled and in most cases tripled. And that's just in that one particular crop. We have professionals who are reading soil moisture monitors, looking at crop water use, making recommendations for that water. In our deep wells, we have technology there that we can look at each well and determine how the water is being pumped, the efficiency of the plant.
It's an eye-opener for me to be here in the Wolf Farm in California to learn about how they're shaping the future of agriculture. Agriculture is a key challenge that we need to address. And that's what would like a huge encouragement from the younger generation to get involved in something so amazing.
Agriculture wasn't the only science that was stimulated in Muslim Spain. There was another technology that took its first steps here too. People have always looked up to the skies and dreamt to fly like a bird. But in the 10th century, one Muslim engineer in Cordoba risked life and limb and became the first man ever to fly. Abbas ibn Firnas was an inventor, engineer, and poet who worked at the court of Cordoba then presided over by the Umayyad dynasty.
Abbas ibn Firnas was someone who we might call a courtier, who was in the close circle around a number of different rulers, but he was also a scientist.
Ibn Firnas spent nearly 20 years studying falling leaves, bats and birds. And then he built what's said to have been the first modern glider.
He constructed a kind of frame for himself and a set of wings, and he did a flying experiment.
He launched himself and flew for 10 minutes. But when it came to landing, he encountered a big problem.
What subsequently happened isn't entirely clear. Some accounts say that he fell rather heavily and injured himself. But it was a very interesting experiment, thinking about aerodynamics, thinking about wings.
But why did he land so heavily? Abbas ibn Firnas thought back to his observations of nature. And he wondered if it was because, just like a bird, his glider needed a tail.
He'd been looking at birds, he'd been looking at the way objects fall, so in a sense he'd been thinking about gravity, and he'd been thinking about ways in which you can get around gravity.
Dr. Hayat's journey across California has now brought her to Los Angeles. Her first stop is Santa Monica Airport to find out what really happened to Ibn Firnas when his glider crashed on landing, and why tails are so important for flying.
Abbas ibn Firnas, he was the first man to fly. And he said, maybe I need a tail to slow the landing or the distance so he can land safely. As a pilot, do we need a tail for the airplane to descend safely?
We do need a tail. The tail actually gives us pitch control, which is one of the most important things for flying. Airplanes have ailerons that control the roll of the aircraft. They have elevators which control the pitch, and birds do the same thing with their wings and with their tails. So if you don't have a tail, you're not going to be able to control your speed through the air. So what I suspect happened is he ended up getting into a nose-low attitude and ended up speeding up, and then had that really, rough landing. And he was right. If you pitch up a little bit, or even get the airplane or the glider to stay more level, it's not going to come down so quickly. It's not going to speed up so quick.
Abbas ibn Firnas in the 9th century, who made actually the first model of airplane. He learned from the nature surrounding him, from a bird, that he needed a tail to fix in his model to be able to land safely. So this is a great message for us as a scientist and as an innovator, to observe the nature around us, to enhance our innovation, our science, and our discovery.
One Muslim inventor, Ibn Firnas, laid the foundations for a means of transport we couldn't live without. There were many different kinds of innovators during the golden age of Islam. Groups of scholars who worked together, like astronomers at observatories or mathematicians at the House of Wisdom. But the golden age also saw some incredibly talented individual scientists who really pushed the limits through meticulous scientific methodology. Extraordinary intellectuals like Ibn al-Haytham, who lived in Egypt's capital, Cairo.
Ibn al-Haytham is probably one of the most famous scholars of the medieval world. In fact, one of the greatest scientists who ever lived. He was an astronomer, he was a mathematician, he was an inventor, he was an experimentalist. Many historians of science now look at Ibn al-Haytham and regard him as one of the earliest true scientists, because he was conducting science in the way we do it today. That he would come up with a theory, a hypothesis, and then he would test it experimentally. And if his experiment didn't agree with the theory, he threw it away.
Ibn al-Haytham was a man of many talents, but he's best known for his groundbreaking work in optics, the study of sight and light. The ancient Greeks believed that the way we saw was because rays shot out of our eyes, lighting up objects. Ibn al-Haytham thought that light entered the eye rather than leave it, but he wanted to rigorously test his hypothesis. So he built a chamber with a tiny hole in the wall and placed a lit candle outside it. He observed how the light travels and forms an image.
He worked with pinhole cameras, a camera obscura, which had been invented by the ancient Chinese. So he would have a tiny hole in this box and have light shine through it and then project an image which is upside down on the back wall. What he did essentially, which we think is pretty trivial today, but he proved that light travels in straight lines. And he used that idea to develop his theory of vision.
Ibn al-Haytham's experiment demonstrated how light rays reflected from an object. But he also understood that the brain was needed to process the image and allow us to see.
Ibn al-Haytham was the first person to explain correctly how vision works. And in his book of optics, the first 2 volumes, he explains very carefully how we see. And that became hugely influential for many hundreds of years later.
The boulevards of Beverly Hills may seem a world away from medieval Cairo. But this vision center in Hollywood is bringing the knowledge of Ibn al-Haytham right up to date.
We consider al-Haytham the father of optics because he is the first one who truly understood that seeing takes place in the brain instead of the eyes. So we have built our inventions and our technology based on his theory of optics. This simple lens can actually help a person walk straight. It can help them with their eye-hand coordination and their depth perception. But over the years, we've made it more and more sophisticated. And so we've used optics to help patients who've had concussions, brain injury.
There are many cutting-edge tools and technologies available to optometrists today, but they still owe a huge debt to Ibn al-Haytham and the painstaking practical work that he did as a scientist.
The more you know about him, the way he was conducting his experiment and the way he went about his findings is so remarkable. He put his observations, his experiments before theory. So that's what I admire about him, and that's what we need from the new generation.
Excellent healthcare and medicine are vital to our busy modern lives. But the story of modern medicine started with a Muslim polymath 1,000 years ago during the golden age of Islam. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, was one of the great physicians in Islam and one of the most amazing medical scholars in history. Ibn Sina was born in the village of Afshana, near present-day Bokhara in Uzbekistan. During his lifetime, he wrote nearly 100 books, one of which, the Canon of Medicine, was translated into Latin and became the standard medical textbook in Europe for centuries. Ibn Sina was the first to recognize tuberculosis as an infectious disease, and he invented the practice of quarantine to limit its spread. Dr. Saleha Ahsan is an emergency doctor who's worked in Kashmir, Libya, and Syria. She's seen just how relevant the ideas in Ibn Sina's book still are in work today.
If you are thinking of medicine, you also have to think of research, of innovation and moving forward. And Ibn Sina, he went and learned and read and saw what was out there and brought it together. How he discovered tuberculosis, I think, is phenomenal, because for us, we have blood tests, we back it up with a chest x-ray, and he didn't have all that. It was his pure knowledge, and he identified the contagiousness of it. I think it's just ingenious.
Ibn Sina, he laid the foundation of many different serious, important discovery, like infectious diseases, like anatomy. He documented in such an amazing way. My advice to the young generation, always combine research and innovation with medicine.
Dr. Hayat has 2 more places to go in Los Angeles. They're both companies working with technologies whose origins can be traced back to an ingenious Muslim engineer in Turkey. The first is an integral part of something we all take for granted: the petrol or diesel-powered car. It's been estimated that there are over 1 billion cars driving in the world today. The majority of them are still powered by the internal combustion engine. And the origins of this innovation can be traced back to Ismail al-Jazari. Al-Jazari was an artist, inventor, and mechanical engineer in the 12th century who lived in Anatolia, which is now part of modern Turkey.
Ismail al-Jazari was one of a number of Muslim specialists in mechanical engineering.
Al-Jazari is best known for writing the Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices, a work which described over 100 skillful instruments and machines.
He took certain elements in mechanics and deployed them in incredibly useful ways to produce devices such as automatons and clocks, for example.
It was the culmination in some ways of mechanical engineering in the Islamic world.
One of al-Jazari's most amazing devices was the double suction pump, designed to draw water to feed gardens and crops. The pump sent water up the delivery pipes by converting rotary motion, the spinning of the wheel, to linear motion, the pistons moving from left to right.
It's one of the earliest examples of transferring circular motion into linear motion through a series of gears. The sort of thing that we would be very familiar with these days, just looking at an old steam train's wheels, for example.
This stroke of genius was vital to modern engineering. It would become an important part of the mechanism inside the internal combustion engine, the machine that powers most cars today. Dr. Hayat has come to one of the premier auto dealers in Los Angeles to see how the car engine still relies on al-Jazari's conversion of motion.
This is just a cutaway. This is not the entire engine, but this shows you the piston, the connecting rod, and the crankshaft that takes the up and down, the linear motion into rotational motion. So in a gasoline-powered engine, you have fuel and air that get introduced into the combustion chamber. A spark plug will give you the spark. When the explosion happens in this chamber, this thing gets pushed back down. So the pistons will have an up and down motion. The crankshaft then translates it to rotational motion and then sends it out to the wheels.
But the double suction pump was only one of al-Jazari's many innovations. Robots and self-operating machines may seem like something straight out of modern science fiction movies, but al-Jazari was one of the first people to come up with the idea of a device that could substitute for humans. He created a design for a musical robot band to entertain guests at royal parties. When water flowed into the boat, it made wooden dancers and musicians perform.
These are contraptions, simple to explain, but you need a genius to invent them in the first place.
Today, robotics can be used in a wide variety of situations: in the home, at work, in manufacturing, or in environments too dangerous for a human. Dr. Hayat has come to a company who've taken the discipline to another planet. Honeybee Robotics specialize in space technology, and they're designing robots for the moon and beyond.
So you can tell us more about why we invented machine.
Sure. So robotics are really in everything. I mean, your toaster will have some robotics in it. And these are robots, even though they're not what people would traditionally think about as robots when that word comes to mind. So they're built for a lot of different reasons. Some are for exploration, going to areas where people can't explore, and some are just to improve lifestyle. But most of the robots do not walk or talk.
One of the robots that Honeybee has created is a tool for space exploration. They can hop across asteroids looking for water, driven only by solar power and steam.
This particular drill is designed to land on asteroids and be able to walk around a little bit on them. The most interesting thing about this is its ability to drill into these asteroids and extract water, if it's there, and then reuse that water as fuel so it can actually leave that asteroid and go to another asteroid and do sort of infinite exploration.
Robotics has come a long way since El-Jazari's original design for a musical boat. But this extraordinary science still depends just as much on big ideas and great leaps of imagination.
Robotics and artificial intelligence are part of our life in every aspect. We do need artificial intelligence for places that we cannot go and want to explore. It's going to be a huge part from our lives. And this is the way forward.
Ismail al-Jazari died in 1206, aged 70. His ideas and inventions were another example of the importance of Islam's golden age. But just half a century later, this extraordinary period of history would be ruptured by a monumental event. The Mongols, led by Genghis Khan and his descendants, were already conquering much of Asia and Eastern Europe. In 1258, they besieged and captured Baghdad, the jewel in the crown of the Muslim world. It was said that so many books from the city's libraries were thrown into the river Tigris that the water ran black with their ink. Many historians call this moment the end of the golden age of Islam. 5 centuries of amazing ideas, learning, and innovation. But the work of Muslim scientists would have a huge influence on the European Renaissance and on the history of the entire world. People used to say that after the 14th century, Europe rose from its dark ages by rediscovering the glories of the classical age. But in fact, the European resurgence was powered just as much by ideas inherited from Muslim science.
When we think about the Renaissance and the great scientists, people like Galileo or Copernicus, they would have had access to Latin translations of Arabic texts. So clearly, a lot of these texts then fed back into the Renaissance movement.
But the science that came through to the European scholars wasn't just ancient Greek knowledge translated into Arabic and then on into Latin. The Golden Age's Muslim scholars took the wisdom of the classical world and then developed, transformed, and improved it.
Muslims and those they were collaborating with didn't just reverentially transmit information. What they were in fact doing was interrogating that knowledge, working with it, building on it, developing it, so that what was passed on was massively modified and enhanced by the Muslims and those working with them through the Golden Age.
This Golden Age of Arabic science was a lot more than simply translating the ancient Greek texts, looking after them while Europe was in its dark ages, and then when Europe reawoke, they dusted them off and said, there you go, guys, we've kept them. Sorry, we've translated them into Arabic. Far from it. Now, the ancient Greeks were very clever, but Arabic science took a lot of that work and that knowledge far, far further. And without it, we wouldn't have had the Renaissance. We wouldn't have had the scientific revolution in Europe, because scientific progress is this continuum.
The rise and fall of science in the medieval Islamic world and its influence on history is an epic tale. These brilliant scientists and scholars developed old ideas and created new innovations, and played a huge part in shaping our modern world.